Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third webinar in the series, all about checking for understanding. My name's Dr. Hayley Hughes, and I'm a Professor of Teacher Coaching and Mentoring, academic at University of Applied Sciences. This is my colleague, Carl. I'll let you introduce yourself.
My name is Carl Hendrick, and I work at Academica, and my focus is on bridging the gap between research and practice.
Fantastic. Shall we get going?
Let's get going. So, checking for understanding. Now, I know you love a bit of checking for understanding, Hayley.
It's my favourite.
You absolutely love it. I think that, as we, go around talking to schools, if there was one thing to get right in the school, like if you just had the time to go, we're just going to do this one thing and get this one thing right for a term, I always say checking for understanding, because it's a place where so many different facets of the science of learning coalesce and cross over. So you've got retrieval, you've got space learning, you've got adaptive teaching, you've got responsive teaching, you've got desirable difficulties. So you've got all of these things in one. And I think that it's one of those things that you instinctively, as a teacher, and even when you're talking to people, your instinct to do or to check it doesn't serve you very well. So we've all done that thing where either we've been taught by a teacher or we've done it ourselves, where we've gone, you've taught something and you go, okay, everyone happy with that? Yeah. Okay, move on. So what we're going to talk about then today, first of all, is the illusion of understanding and this distinction between performance and learning. I then want to look at some of the origins of checking for understanding, and then we'll look at this matrix, which is a kind of 5-point way of planning for checking for understanding. And then Hayley's going to look at it in a lot more detail. We're going to look at some close examples, and then we'll look at some lethal mutations, because I think it's not just enough to know what it is, but it's important to know what it isn't. So the illusion of understanding. Well, I think this is one of those things that is so counterintuitive that when you first come across it, it's very jarring. And it's this idea that performance in the short term is a very bad indicator of long-term learning. And so when you go into a room, if you're observing a lesson, you can see students being very, very busy, very, very engaged, and in fact, often looking like they're actually working hard and learning a lot. And at the same time, almost no learning happening. And so part of checking for understanding is to address that problem of that kind of illusory nature of performance. Certainly when I started teaching, there was a lot of performance masquerading as learning. And one of the ways that people would measure effective teaching was how engaging the lesson was. And there was this sense that you could kind of con kids into learning by creating a set of activities that would entice them into learning and really get them moving. So the first thing to do is to really think about this illusion. The origins of this term, and I've been doing a lot of reading on this recently, and I'd urge anyone to go back if you can find them. I think some of them are out of print now, but Madeline Hunter wrote some books going back to the 60s and 70s, and she didn't really originate anything herself. She sort of took a little bit of Bruner, a little bit of DI, a little bit of mastery learning and Bloom and stuff that was floating around in the 50s and 60s. And she wrote these very accessible books for teachers. And they're really, really good. But from my research, I think the original term, checking for understanding, originates from her. And it's, I was reading this book this week, and it's amazing to me how she was talking about checking for understandings, not just leading to better outcomes for kids, but also as a much more efficient way of teachers using their time. So instead of teaching a lesson right, kids, on Friday, you're going to do a written assessment. I'll take that back. 3 or 4 days later, you mark it. A couple of days later, you give it back to them. 10 days after they've done it, you're checking for understanding. And you've spent an hour and a half writing comments and everything. Then they look at it and they don't really remember anything that they were supposed to understand. They just look at the grade. So it's a very inefficient way of checking for that. And what I find particularly interesting about instructional design from the 60s and 70s, and then less so in the 80s with Twillers, there's this kind of laser-like focus on efficiency. How do we really use our time effectively in getting kids to learn stuff? Now, I should say that checking for understanding, it's really formative assessment. So Dylan Williams' formulation of assessment for learning is incredibly useful. But Dylan's fantastic with kind of phrasing things. But one of the phrases that I always remember from him is that feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. So the person receiving the feedback should have more work than the person giving it. In this case, I think you have a slight inversion of that, because checking for understanding is not so much a benchmark tool as a diagnostic one. So you're not really checking to see what they know. You're checking to see what you need to do next as a teacher. And that's a really important difference, I think. A big thing with checking for understanding is it's not a one and done thing. It occurs continuously with throughout instruction. Now, this was a big part of direct instruction, both capital D, capital I, and lowercase d, lowercase I. Direct instruction with capital letters is a particular program formulated in the 60s by Engelman and Wes Becker. It is, you have scripted lessons, you have a very tight curriculum, a very kind of strong focus on mastery. Then you get a model called explicit direct instruction by Hollingsworth and Ybarra. Very practical, very useful. And it will surprise many of our listeners and viewers to learn that in that book, well, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to consider this. What do you think is the time they advise that you should leave before checking for understanding? In other words, what's the maximum amount of time that a teacher should talk before they somehow check in with the students? How long should a teacher talk before eliciting some kind of thinking from the students? Well, if I said 5 minutes, you'd be surprised. But it's actually 2 minutes. So they advocate that you are almost constantly checking in with the students in some form to see what they've learned and how they've learned it. The key thing then is that it's what you do with it that matters. It's how you adapt to the fluctuations in learning in the class. And I think another important thing is that it gives a lot of feedback to the students as well. So they're picking up themselves. They're able to say, oh, well, I didn't quite get that. Another key feature of EDI, explicit direct instruction, is they recommend that as a diagnostic tool, you want to get about 80% success rate. So if you teach something and you go, okay, I'm going to now check for understanding, as a kind of a temperature check, a rough guide, if less than 80% are comfortable or understand it, you need to go back and teach that again. So you might kind of say, okay, I can see not everyone quite got that. Let me try it this way. So you're adapting what you're doing to meet the learning needs. And that also then gives the students within a lesson, oh, I didn't quite learn that, so I need to try it a different way this time. It's a bridge between what you've taught and what's learned. And again, a huge problem we've got in teaching is that the feedback loops are very long. But my theory is that a lot of that is our fault. So typically what we do, and a lot of departments do this and they still do this, when they talk about assessment, they talk about marking, which is really kind of two different things. And they talk about marking every 10 days or 2 weeks. Some schools do it every week. And if you consider the feedback loops between the time that the student is learning that material and the time that they find out whether they've learned it, it's almost too long. So that bridge between what's taught and what's learned is really important. If there was one kind of guiding principle behind checking for understanding, and if I was leading this in a school, and again, let's say you wanted to address checking for understanding over a term, the slogan I would be repeating ad infinitum would be if, but not what. In other words, you want to, it's not so much if they've understood it, you want to find out what they've understood. And that means you have to show me. So I don't want to know if you think you've understood it. I want you to show me what you understand. And we'll go into some tips and ways of doing that today that are quite efficient. So let's say you're planning for checking for understanding. Let's say you're teaching a unit, or let's say you're teaching a single lesson. There's really 5 things to think about. And I've put together this matrix. And there's really sort of 5 essential elements to checking for understanding. The first one is timing. So this really is about when the understanding is going to be checked. And you've got a number of options here. One thing you could do is you could assess their understanding before you teach them anything. And that would maybe allow you to slightly kind of change what you're doing. You might be taking a class for the first time. You might be doing material that some of them have already done. But that gives you a base camp to which to move from. The second element is you want to think about the form, the modality. What are you going to do that? So you've got a number of options here. At the kind of simplest level, you can give students 3 answers to a question that you ask. What is the right answer to this question? A, B, or C? Or 1, 2, and 3, and you can get the students to finger vote for that. What some practitioners do is they'll say, well, kids often copy, but if you have a number of options here, you can get them to do it under the chin, or you can get them to close their eyes and do it. And that's a kind of low-cost way of doing it. Holly will go into this in more detail, but the mini whiteboards are kind of becoming the most ubiquitous feature in school. Incredibly useful. A bit of a faff at times, but if you get some routines in place, it's very helpful. You can do a choral response where you get them all to answer collectively, or you could do something like cold calling. But what you want to avoid is basically asking them if they understand it, because of course they understand it, whether they do or no. They'll say they do. Right. Number 3, the difficulty. Now, this is where you can sort of overlap into desirable difficulties. And this is a judgment element. Do you want them to simply just know the times tables? That's just a simple recall. Do you know what this is? Recall it back. But you might want them to apply different elements of knowledge. So you might use a think, pair, share model. 30 seconds, think about this question, then turn to your partner. Participation means who's going to be doing it? Who are you going to be asking? Are you going to be cold calling individual students? Obviously, pair share, you can do small groups or whole class. One of the things, and maybe Hailey, you could mention this a little bit later on, is we get a lot of schools and teachers saying, well, I'm not comfortable with cold calling because we just don't, a lot of the students are afraid to answer and they're uncomfortable and it puts them on the spot. I think you can create a culture where people are willing to have a go. And that is about norms and routines. But you have a number of options. And if you do have a class that are uncomfortable with that method of checking for understanding, you can always address that by doing something else. The fifth element in this matrix is the most important. It's not whether they've got it right or wrong. It's what you do next as a teacher. And if you consider it like this, let's say in an hour lesson, maybe you're not checking for understanding every 2 minutes. Maybe you're doing it every 5-10 minutes. But let's say you do it on an average of 5 or 6 times, and you're getting 30 pieces of data from each student in your class. You're getting an incredibly rich picture of the learning of that class. That's much more valid and reliable than if you were to use the other sort of temperature gauges of enthusiasm, engagement, short-term performance, so on and so forth. Because you're getting that, kids can kind of con a teacher that they're learning stuff once, twice. They can't do it 3, 4, 5 times in a lesson. So you're able to build up a kind of very vibrant 3D vivid picture of the learning of your students by getting those data points constantly throughout the lesson. And the most important thing is that the teacher will adapt to what's happening. Another question we often get asked is, okay, so let's say you got 80% getting it right. You got the 20% who they don't understand it. They're not dealing with it. Again, you have a number of different options. You can give a task to the 80% to get on with, and you take that group and you say, okay, let's go over this again. I can see you're not quite happy with that. We'll just have a little look at this again. Now we're going to talk about our favorite corner, lethal mutation corner. Hailey.
I feel like I'm on Blue Peter or something, and this is like a regular feature. I want my badge. So yeah, we do love talking about lethal mutations. It's become like a favourite hobby of mine.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of preface this section really to sort of sum up everything that Carl was saying about checking for understanding. And basically, I believe it is probably the most kind of high leverage thing that a teacher can do to help students make progress. But it is only effective if it actually does what it says on the tin, which is diagnose understanding and leads to us making instructional adjustments, to us adapting our teaching to meet our students where they are and push them and scaffold. So there's loads of ways that this can go wrong, like with any kind of strategies or approaches, and I'm going to talk about some of those now. So the first one, asking, does it make sense? This kind of alludes to what Carl was saying before about that sort of surface checking for understanding that we sometimes do. Like sometimes I go in to watch lessons and teachers will say to me, oh yeah, I checked for understanding, but did they though, really? Because what they did is asked, does that make sense to students? And they all kind of nodded, and they either nod because they don't want to appear confused or to not know what's going on, or they actually just want to carry on with the lesson and not go over it again. Or actually sometimes they just lack kind of the metacognitive awareness to actually recognize where the gaps are in their own understanding. So, instead of doing something like that, it would be much better, as Carl said, to possibly ask those targeted specific questions. And those questions need to be questions that actually require our students to demonstrate understanding, such as, can you explain that in your own words? And we'll give some more quite useful ways of doing that in just a moment's time. And, Carl talked about cold calling, and it's so funny, actually. I go to so many schools in the UK where people say, oh, we couldn't cold call in our classrooms. It's cruel. Have you heard that, Carl? Cold calling, yeah. It's cruel, it's fascist.
Yeah.
I think people need to read some history books if they think cold calling students and asking them to contribute into lessons is fascist. But I think it's all about culture, isn't it, with cold calling? I think we should just address that now. And if it becomes that normal supportive part of the lesson and not a tool for catching students out, it's one of the most impactful tools that we can have. So establishing that kind of no opt-out culture, and Doug Lamont talks about this a lot. And modelling actually as a teacher how to respond positively to mistakes. So, that's really interesting. Can anyone help refine that idea? So cold calling for me is one of the best ways that we can actually do that. So the second lethal mutation I want to talk about is only checking a few students. And I see this all the time. And it's usually like the kids on the front row, right? Or the vocal students who always want to answer or raise the hand. And what happens there is that we don't get that full picture of class-wide understanding. So a better alternative might be that cold calling we talked about. It might be turn and talk, or even using mini whiteboards like Carl was talking about earlier. And I do think mini whiteboards are a funny one. They've been massive in primary for years. We're talking 25, 30 years. And then I think it might have been Kate Jones who wrote the Williams and Leigh sort of action book. And inside it talked about secondaries using mini whiteboards. And it was as if we just discovered them, and primary teachers were kind of like, hold my beer, we've been using them for 30 years. But, you know, as Carl said, they can be a faff, but lots of schools now have them printed on the back of planners so that students always have them with them, or students have to have them as part of, you know, equipment. And I think that's a great idea. So the next lethal mutation is this idea about accepting quite vague or even superficial responses. So, you know, a student might give you quite a generic answer, which actually we might then sort of bat up a little bit. So an example of this from my own teaching, and I was so guilty of this sometimes, is that I would ask them, you know, why was life in Victorian England really hard for poor people? And one of my kids might say, oh, well, you know, because they have no money. And I might say, excellent, they had no money, there was no NHS, and I'd spend 5 minutes describing it. And what I've done there is checked for my own understanding, not the understanding of pupils. And what I should have been is probably a bit more Bonnie Tyler and held out for a hero a little bit more. So, you know, we can get quite guilty of that as teachers, and really, you know, Doug Lemov calls it right is right. And we've really got to kind of use those probing follow-ups. Why do you think that? Can you give me an example? You know, can you give me a bit more, please? I think one of the things that I was a little guilty of this as a teacher as well is when we only focus on the right answers. So very often we'll check for understanding and we'll acknowledge those correct answers. We might probe a little bit as well. But actually what we do is we misdiagnosing the misconceptions and discourage that risk taking as well. So if we, as I was saying before, normalise mistakes as learning opportunities, but also probe those misconceptions as well. Misconceptions can be so powerful. And, you know, find out why the students made those misconceptions, because if one student is in the class, you can bet your bottom dollar that there are others doing the same thing as well. So addressing those misconceptions is a really good way of checking for understanding. So the last couple that I wanted to talk about is this idea of kind of, right, anyway, moving on. And what that sort of suggests is that actually we might be collecting, checking for understanding data, but actually what we're not doing is adjusting our instruction based on those findings. And if we're doing that, well, actually, what are we checking for understanding for? It's got little purpose at all. So if we are checking for understanding and we see that actually there's quite a few in the class that haven't grasped the concept, we need to then use those reteaching strategies through our adaptive teaching or even targeted interventions so we can identify those gaps and fill them as well. And my last lethal mutation, which is probably one of my favourite ones actually, is that non-rigorous methods of checking for understanding. And Carl touched on this before. So that idea of thumbs up or thumbs down if you get it. And I'm going to show you now why this is a big problem. So I'm going to embed a video. I've never done this before, so hopefully it works.
Right, okay, finish up the one you are doing. Okay, let's mark them. Right, I'll quickly read out the answers just to save us a bit of time. Question 1A was 32, B was 81, C was 125, D was 256, E was 2,197, F was 50,625, G 5,832, H 441. Show me with your thumbs, please. Excellent. Right, example 2.
So, young lad there, you may have seen, teacher's giving him the answers, the self-marking. He got about 2 into it, realised he hadn't got a clue, kind of folded his arms like this and went and stopped and put his pen down. And then teacher says, thumbs up if you've got it, and he's the first one with his thumbs up. So, you know, it doesn't really tell us anything if we've got students just going like this. It's really kind of superficial, that there's no rigor in it at all. A better alternative would be much better to have some kind of low stakes quiz, or even the whiteboards or the cold calling with the probing questions like we were talking about before. So I like to show that video because I think it's a really good example of where checking for understanding is just a tick box exercise. It's doing nothing for the teacher or the kids. So I want to give you some examples now. We want these webinars to be really practical as well as kind of evidence-based as well. So I've tried to give some examples from a couple of different subjects. I think that's really important. So I'm going to start off with some strategies that are quite generic actually, and can be used for quite a lot of subjects and different phases as well. And I've even used these teaching in HE. I'm sure that you have, Carl, as well, probably. So the first strategy that I wanted to share with you and talk about, and by the way, some of these are taken from the brilliant ideas in teaching walkthroughs by Tom and Ollie, you know, some taken from kind of research papers as well. So the first strategy is this idea of summarising. So if we are, for example, exploring an academic text in geography, in history, we might stop at key moments and ask the students to summarise what they've understood so far. And what this does is it prevents us from that delusion that Carl was talking about that we sometimes get when we're teachers, that actually the kids are with us, that they're following us. And actually using summarising is a really great thinking process as well for the students who are asked. So something like, okay, excellent. So that's how a braided channel's formed. Let's try to summarise the main steps. John, have a go. So summarising can be really, really helpful, especially when reading a kind of academic text. Repeating instructions is also a really good strategy to try as well. And Tom Sherrington talks about how a lot of teachers, when you suggest this as a strategy, might say, actually, that seems really obvious. But actually, it's not routine for everybody. And I think certainly for myself, who was in the classroom for sort of 20 years, you get into that automaticity and that habit. And sometimes you actually forget to do some of like the fundamental stuff. And I genuinely think repeating instructions can be one of those things. So what you might do whenever you've given instructions for a task or an activity, you might get a couple of people then to repeat those instructions back to you and check that they thoroughly understood the details. So for example, all right, before we all get going, Mike, can you run through that procedure for me? What do we have to do? So something as simple as that, make sure that you're capturing everybody and you're taking them with you. Another really useful strategy is the agree or disagree strategy. And as well as helping our pupils really form their own opinions, it gives them the scope to agree and disagree as well, and secures attention as well. So it can be quite a good soft check this for engagement as well as for understanding actually. And then you would embed, for example, a probing question like the and why after it as well, where students can give their reasons. So for example, you know, should school uniform be worn? Do you agree or disagree? James, why is that? So you can really check that they've understood the key concepts that you talked about. Thinking the problem aloud is a great one as well, and speaks to kind of metacognitive strategies as well. We do this a lot as teachers when we're modelling using the visualizer, for example, but promoting this kind of metacognitive talk can be a really powerful approach to teaching and learning and checking for understanding, this kind of thinking out loud. Because what it does is make students' thoughts visible, and we can see how they're working out the way they'll approach a task, and it's a really great tool for checking for understanding. So, okay, before we crack on with this task then, let's plan what we're going to do. Okay, James, let's hear your thoughts. Talk through your ideas, and then we'll talk about how you're going to organise them. And then defend or explain your position can be linked to the agree or disagree we looked at a little bit earlier. So when our students give an opinion, it's really helpful to check that they actually understand the underlying concepts underneath it, instead of just learning kind of stock responses, basically, without a supporting schema. So if students give an initial response, you would then probe further, asking them to explain some of the key points, defend the position, or maybe even give a counter argument as a reference as well. So lots of ideas that can be used in lots of different phases or settings there. To get more subject specific, this fantastic resource is open access on the website PE Scholar. And this is a whole kind of one pager, if you like, on checking for understanding. And you can see there some really, really useful PE specific strategies that can be used. Things like performing a routine or set play and then asking students to give a verbal description of it. Explaining the safety setup for an activity, and then a couple of minutes later getting a student to repeat that back to you. And if you haven't seen this website before, I want to give it a shout out because it's absolutely full of really PE specific science of learning strategies and activities. It's a really, really good one to look at. And I often think, Carl, this subject specific use of these strategies is one of the best bits of CPD that a teacher can get.
Yeah.
And then the last one is actually a video from Teach Like a Champion. I'm not going to play it to you, but what I will do is put the URL for it, which is from the Teach Like a Champion website, actually into the chat now. So you'll be able to see that on YouTube if you're watching live and watching the recording a little bit later on. And this is a brilliant video, like all the Teach Like a Champion videos, and it shows checking for understanding a specific art context. And you don't often see videos of some of the more practical subjects like art and design and technology and food technology. And what the teacher does here is he tells his students 3 key things that he's looking for, and he walks around the room giving feedback. So the students already know what he's going to be checking for. So he's checking for understanding in the practical work that they're doing. And it's really nice the way he spells it out to students, directs their attention as they draw, and then it inadvertently almost causes them to focus on the skills even before he gives them any feedback. So it's a really, really clever way of doing it, which is very specific actually to a more practical subject such as art and design. So do have a look at that video. Really, really great strategies, and hopefully that's given you a few ideas for how you can implement some checking for understanding strategies in your own subject. So we've probably got a couple of minutes left for questions. If anybody wants to type any in the chat, we can do.
Yeah, do type some questions in the chat if you got them. I was just going to ask you, Hailey, so what's your thoughts on how this plays out in secondary versus primary? And then what's your thoughts on how different it looks like in different subjects?
Yeah, really good question. So I think sort of the generic ones that I went through, the strategies could work in both phases. I mean, obviously a lot of the checking for understanding in sort of early years, for example, you know, I have a daughter who's in year 2 at the moment, just come out of, you know, kind of reception in year 1. And a lot of that checking for understanding, I should imagine, is going to be verbal. It's going to be questioning. It's going to be those probing questions. You know, obviously some checking for understanding is going to be verbal in secondary, quite a lot of it actually. I mean, you probably have seen the fantastic videos of Pratesh's lessons that Step Lab have just shared in their sort of brilliant documentary that Peps McRae's made. And his checking for understanding is just unreal. And this is one of the things that really kind of irritates me about the lazy arguments about direct instruction, is that it's just a teacher at the front of the room kind of talking for the whole lesson. And if you go back and watch Engelman's videos, so many questions to check for understanding. So I think in primary and secondary, verbal checking for understanding is great, but we have to avoid that superficial questioning that we were talking about, where students are literally just getting out things that they've memorized and don't really understand. So you've got to have that probing question there. I've seen whiteboards utilised amazingly in primaries, utilised amazingly in secondaries. I think I really like turn and talk as a strategy, but I think we need to be careful with that as well if we're using just that for checking for understanding. Like I've seen some teachers say, right, turn and talk to the person next to you, and then that's been their checking for understanding. Yeah. But how does the person who the child is talking to know that they're getting that right, because they're still novice learners? So, you know, and I think the subject-specific use of different checking for understanding strategies is really important. We're both English teachers, or we're English teachers.
Yeah.
you know, how I might check for understanding, I would spend quite a long time checking for understanding in English with those probing questions, because in English, you're not going to get those kind of conceptualized responses, those big marks for just factual knowledge. It's got to have that interpretive based on the knowledge as well.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I noticed was when I was a teacher, there was this effect where if you were teaching, say, a class, there's about 5 kids in the class who are really keen and really read the material, really interested. And as the lesson goes on, they're speaking up more. They're giving very confident answers. And you can see the rest of the class almost kind of shrinking back. And you just end up, it's just 4 people talking in the lesson. It's you and these 4 kids, and everyone else is kind of intimidated. The other thing I wanted to say about this is, Lee Schulman's idea of pedagogical content knowledge is really important here, because the teacher really has to have quite a sort of horizontal knowledge of what they're teaching, because they need to just not know what or how students can get it right. They need to know how they can get it wrong. And a really good teacher, if they've been teaching content for a long time, they'll have this very kind of 3D picture of the thing, and they'll know here's a very common way that students can misunderstand this. So I used to always you'd always preempt mistakes that students would make if you understand it very well. You don't just understand the topic, you understand that they're going to spell this word incorrectly, they're going to confuse these concepts. So you're almost kind of trying to flag up those misconceptions.
What about if you're a novice teacher, though, Carl? Because obviously novice teachers, they might not have simply the mental models, to be honest, to know what the misconceptions might be. So what do you think we do there?
So here, to me, that's a curriculum question. So if you have, let's say you're teaching Macbeth, right? You're teaching Macbeth to GCSE, and you are teaching a particular scene. You know the scene well, but you might look through the scene and identify 10 words, concepts, analogies, ideas that are definitely going to cause problems for a 14-year-old. And then you want to maybe have some sort of structure where you can link it to previous knowledge and or what they know. But this is where I'm coming around to the idea, Hailey, that really we should have, or there should be some sort of instructional design curricula where you're given this, if you like, great song that you can then improvise off, as opposed to having to write your own classic every day, 5 times a day. So you're given, right, I could look through this scene, and I'm a novice teacher now, and I'm going to go, oh, right, so they spell separate wrong all the time, do they? They spell separate with an E as opposed to an A. All right, I'll look out for that. Oh, right, so that they don't know these biblical references. Oh, right, okay, right. I'll brush up on them then. I'll get that ready. This concept, this part of the scene kind of drags on a bit. So in other words, that you're just coming in at a very kind of heightened level, and you're just ready to kind of focus on. I mean, checking for understanding really at its heart is about getting kids to think, getting them to be cognitively engaged, where there's really nowhere for them to go other than just kind of think about things.
Yeah.
So that is, I think, really important. And again, if I'd had a very well sequenced, knowledge-rich curriculum when I was first started teaching, I wouldn't have been doing crap lessons where I'm showing them
card sorts and laminated.
Like spending the hour before the lesson cutting up stuff and putting it in envelopes and all that nonsense.
That guillotine, man, that was my best friend 20 years ago.
The guillotine and the laminator, and I mean, I remember there was a lesson floating around about 20 years ago that every English teacher tried, and it was sort of like you come in with a box and an item in the box, and you pass it round, and all the kids have got to guess what's in the box, right? And then they write down like a description of the thing in the box, so that the kids are shaking it around and all this kind of stuff.
There was a similar one that Sam Gibbs talks about all the time. It was a sherbet lemon. Which was an English one. So basically every kid got a sherbet lemon, and you got, you suck it in, fantastic, scrumptious, and then obviously your floor is full of sherbet lemon wrappers after the lesson.
But they're so engaged, Tylee. They're so engaged.
And what did you understand about this lesson? I had a sweet.
It was fairly common around 20 years ago to get kids to rewrite Shakespeare scenes in the language of text messages.
It was, yeah, and Facebook
profiles, Nando's checking for understanding, all that kind of stuff. So again, I think a lot of that is about having a belief in kids, and if you're saying to kids, you can rewrite this scene that I've just explained to you in text messages, to be or not to be, as in the letter 2, the number 2, and a B emoticon, to be or not to be, right? What the implicit message there you're saying to kids is, I don't really think you're that smart.
No.
I actually think that the only thing you're capable of is doing this in text message format. And obviously we have kids with particular needs that we want to meet, but I've never met a student who doesn't rise to some sort of high expectations.
Agreed. And anyway, if you're getting to write a Facebook profile now, my 17-year-old tells me Facebook is dead and it's for old people. So there you go. So on that note.
Yeah. Well, on that bombshell, we'll say farewell. Next week is the final webinar in this series. We will we'll have lots more coming, but I hope you've enjoyed that. And the course that we are doing, we have created a course in 3 parts based on books that we wrote, How Learning Happens and Teaching Happens. We want schools to sign up. We have a huge amount of schools already signed up already. We've got a great network building. You can take the course at your leisure, and we have different events that we're doing, and we hope to see you there. So do check that out. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.